Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I will start reading Majjhima Nikaya 147, the Shorter Discourse of Advice to Rāhula. The particular translation that I am using is Bhikkhu Bodhi's. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then, while the Blessed One was alone in meditation, a thought arose in his mind thus: the states that ripen in deliverance have ripened in Rāhula. Suppose I were to lead him on further to the destruction of the taints. Then, when it was morning, the Blessed One dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, went into Savatthi for alms. When he had walked for alms in Savatthi and had returned from his alms round, after his meal he addressed the Venerable Rāhula thus: Take your sitting cloth with you, Rāhula. Let us go to the blind man's grove to pass the day. Yes, Venerable Sir, the Venerable Rāhula replied, and taking his sitting cloth with him, he followed close behind the Blessed One. Now, on that occasion, many thousands of deities followed the Blessed One, thinking, today the Blessed One will lead the Venerable Rāhula further to the destruction of the taints. Then the Blessed One went into the blind man's grove and sat down at the root of a certain tree on a seat made ready. And the Venerable Rāhula paid homage to the Blessed One and sat down at one side. The Blessed One then said to the Venerable Rāhula, Rāhula, what do you think? Is the I permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering and subject to change fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself? No, Venerable Sir. Rāhula, what do you think? Are forms impermanent or are forms permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering and subject to change fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself? No, Venerable Sir. Rāhula, what do you think? Is I conscious? Is I contact? Is anything comprised within the feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness that arise with eye contact as condition permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering and subject to change fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself? No, Venerable Sir. Rāhula, what do you think? Is the ear permanent or impermanent? Is the nose permanent or impermanent? Is the tongue permanent or impermanent? Is the body permanent or impermanent? Is the mind permanent or impermanent? Are mind objects? Is mind consciousness? Is mind contact? Is anything comprised within the feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness that arise with mind contact as condition permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, Venerable Sir. Is what is impermanent suffering and subject to change fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself? No, Venerable Sir. Seeing thus, Rāhula, a well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with the I, disenchanted with forms, disenchanted with eye consciousness, disenchanted with eye contact, and disenchanted with anything comprised within the feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness that arise with eye contact as condition. He becomes disenchanted with the ear. He becomes disenchanted with the nose. He becomes disenchanted with the tongue. He becomes disenchanted with the body. He becomes disenchanted with the mind, disenchanted with the mind objects, disenchanted with mind consciousness, disenchanted with mind contact, and disenchanted with anything comprised within the feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness that arise with mind contact as condition. Being disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, his mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge it is liberated. He understands birth is destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more coming to any state of being. This is what the Blessed One said. The Venerable Rāhula was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. Now, while this discourse was being spoken, through not clinging, the Venerable Rāhula's mind was liberated from the taints. And in those many thousands of deities, there arose the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma. All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. So obviously what I read was a abbreviated form of the sutta, but what one needs to understand is that the Buddha is taking into account each of the six sense bases: the eye, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the skin, and the mind. And as he takes each of these six sense bases, he's also taking into account the external elements of those bases. In other words, the eye and the visual forms, the ear and the auditory signals, the nose and the odors and fragrances, the tongue and the tastes, the skin and the sense of touch or tangibles, the mind and mental objects, in this case, thoughts. So from each of these, he then further divides them up into the 5 aggregates that are connected with each of these 6 sense bases. So he's taking into account the contact which arises from each of the 6 sense bases, the feeling, the perception, the formations, and the consciousness. And as he does this, he then inquires with Rāhula that are these arising and passing away of these 5 aggregates in relation to contact with each and any of the 6 sense bases, impermanent or permanent. And Rāhula, with wisdom and understanding, which he has gained through collectedness, is able to understand that it is impermanent and therefore suffering, and therefore not worth holding on to, and therefore not considered to be a sense of self or a personal sense of self. Now, going back a little bit, if you look at this particular sutta, you can consider it to be the last part of a trilogy of suttas related to Rāhula. The very first sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya is related in relation to Rāhula, and the Buddha's advice to him is in relation to false speech, and by broader context, in relation to keeping one's precepts. He explains to Rāhula the importance of keeping such precepts and therefore developing and cultivating morality and ethics or sila. Once you do this, the mind then gradually and naturally inclines towards a state of clarity, towards a state of balance. And it is with this mind that there is a foundation for samadhi, for collectedness. And therefore, in the second part of this so-called trilogy, as I put it, in there, Rāhula is advised by first Sariputta to develop the samadhi of anapanasati, to understand the breath, to use the breath as a vehicle for meditation, to be able to cultivate that collectedness in one's mind. And then Rāhula goes to the Buddha to inquire about how to develop the breath meditation. However, before the Buddha talks about the breath meditation, about seeing the breath, breathing in and tranquilizing the formations and so on and such, the Buddha first prescribes to Rāhula the foulness of the body meditation, because there was in Rāhula an attachment to the body. There was in Rāhula a sense of self that he attached to the elements of the body. But when the Buddha first prescribed to Rāhula the foulness of the body, to look at the body and divide it up into different elements, such as the four great elements, and then going even further down into the coarse elements or coarse aspects of the body, from the skin, from the head to the toe, to the organs of the body, to the nerves of the body, and so on and so forth. And in doing this, Rāhula starts to detach that delusion of attaching a sense of self to the body. And once he understands that there is no permanent self in the body, he starts to become more collected in his mind, and therefore builds a further foundation to develop that samadhi. And it's only then that he learns the breath meditation, or the tranquilizing of formations using the breath as the object or vehicle of meditation. In this third part, the Buddha, deciphering Rāhula's mind, understands that Rāhula has reached a certain point in his meditation practice. Primarily, he has at the very least reached infinite consciousness. And this can be said because the Buddha thus then inquires into the nature of the six sense bases, internal and external, and the five aggregates that are connected with it. And this wisdom, this insight, only arises when you reach the level, at the very least, of infinite consciousness. And this is because at the level of infinite consciousness, in the realm of infinite consciousness, the mind has already developed such that it has gone through each of the four form jhanas, through the first, second, third, and fourth jhana, and now entered upon the fifth jhana, or the realm of infinite space. And then as it does this, it starts to expand the awareness of space. And eventually, as that expansion of awareness of space continues, at a certain point, there is a different kind of experience that arises. Now, this depends upon the formations in a person's mind that are either large in numbers or are strengthened in their ability to come forward through intention and then be experienced through one of the six sense bases. Which means that if the formations related to the eye and eye contact are stronger, one will start to experience infinite consciousnesses of the eye. Or in other words, will start to experience something like flickers in one's field of vision, or see a ring of light in the periphery of one's vision within the meditation, which starts to arise and then dissipate. Or in the case of one whose formations related to ear contact is stronger, they will experience certain flickers, auditory flickers. They might hear like different kinds of beats and flickering sounds. And when this happens, they are experiencing the arising and passing away of each ear consciousness and sound consciousness. Sometimes it may happen that a being may experience it through the other senses. They may experience it through certain odors and fragrances that suddenly arise. They may experience it through certain tastes that might arise on the tongue, or certain jolts of electricity or different sensations on the skin. Or they might start to see that their thoughts that might have been there in the background are starting to recede even further, and there is a spaciousness between one thought and the other. In any of these experiences, what is happening is that the being is seeing into the nature of consciousness itself that is rooted in sensory experiences. And when one sees this, one is face to face with the three factors or the three symptoms of reality, the three marks of existence, the three characteristics. First and foremost, one sees that each of the flickering, each of the arising and passing away of these separate consciousnesses is one iota of consciousness. There cannot be an eternal consciousness in that sense. And since it's arising and passing away, consciousness is therefore impermanent in any of these six sense bases and experiences. Then one experiences the understanding and seeing that it gets tiresome to continue to see this arising and passing away. This is on the micro level of the mind, but this can also be expanded and translated on the macro level of rebirth in the case of karma and formations that take those karma into a different mentality and materiality at the passing away of one body or mentality materiality and the birth of another. And you see that this is the nature of samsara itself, that there is a constant and continuous arising and passing away, a continuous flux. And therefore, you cannot consider it to be a permanent consciousness, a permanent sense of self. And it is dependent upon various factors, causes, and conditions, and therefore it is not an independent sense of self. And because it gets tiresome, eventually one sees that there is only suffering in taking what is permanent, in taking what is impermanent as permanent, in taking what is not self as self, in taking what is suffering as long-lasting happiness. So now going back to the sutta, once Rāhula has understood this at the level of the fifth and then sixth jhana, he then comes to a point where his mind is ripe to destroy the taints or the defilements or the projections. And these projections are the projection of sensual craving. It's the projection of being, the craving for existence, and the projection for or of ignorance, of not knowing the Four Noble Truths or understanding them. So finally, the Buddha translates this into the five aggregates and the clinging aspect of the five aggregates. Let's understand what these five aggregates are really. Up until this point, up until this moment, everything that has led to this moment in terms of where you are, so to speak, within the body, where you are, so to speak, within your sensations or feelings, and how you perceive objects and things and situations, and the formations that are rooted and arisen from those perceptions, and the consciousnesses that arise and pass away, rooted in those experiences, are all built up. They are built up through the flow of the links of dependent origination. So in every second, in every moment, you have a countless number of the links of dependent origination arising and passing away. But as the arising and passing away occurs, what is being built up are in some sense a repository of certain experiences. And those experiences are then translated into the clinging aspect of the five aggregates. And then what happens is all the memories, all of the experiences, whether good or bad, all of the inclinations, all of the desires, all of the associations are nothing but accumulated tendencies that is happening through the accumulation of tendencies. In other words, as one starts to crave whatever is being experienced, as one starts to attach a personalized sense of self to the experience that is occurring, whether it is the mind that says I want it or I don't want it and wants none of it and therefore suffers, and then attaches and clings to a sense of self through the link of clinging, which is then the accumulation of certain tendencies, which then becomes the accumulated tendencies, which is the being or the becoming or the bhava in Pali. And this being and becoming that occur in that link are the accumulated tendencies that then further solidify into the clinging aspect and the identification aspect of each of the five aggregates. And therefore, that's why it is said that in essence, in short, when the first noble truth is explained and expanded, in the very end it is said, in short, the five clinging aggregates are suffering. That is because the accumulation of these tendencies, of these associations, of these concepts, of these ideas, of these thoughts, and of these reactions and responses are what then solidify into what we then, in some sense, inherit through the clinging and through the craving, which then becomes the clinging aspect of the five aggregates. So this body of ours, which is the form aggregate, it is continuously changing on the microscopic level, on the subatomic level. There is always change occurring in our cellular structure. The body goes through different processes that is related to aging, that is related to sickness, that is related to recovery, that is related to stresses, that is related to different causes and conditions outside of itself. And this is the natural part of existence. The fact that the form itself is impermanent. But what happens is that the clinging aspect is what makes us crave for more, or crave for less, or attach a sense of self to this form, to this body. Likewise, the sensations that we experience continue to evolve and change and transform and go through different processes of change. We experience certain things one way in one moment, and then we can experience that same thing in another way in a different moment. And this is because of the way we perceive things. This is exemplified by the fact that certain memories that we have of certain individuals in our lives, if we are rooted in perceptions that are unwholesome, we start to think in we start to think in negative patterns that are associated with that individual. But as soon as we start to cultivate wholesome qualities of mind, our perception shifts, and then we experience and feel different things about that person, and it could also be about the situation, about the place, and about the sensations that are arising. And that, of course, leads into perception itself, which arises from memory and learning. Perception is the recognition aspect of the mind, and this is continuously changing as information evolves. As the mind's knowledge and information grows, so do the perceptions change based on the relevant information. For example, a very simple example. When the mind perceives a certain color, let's say as a child, you see the color blue, but you don't know what color it is or what to call it. You can see and cognize that color, but it is only upon learning that that color is called blue that then you have that stored in memory for later, from which the perception aspect of the five aggregates then is able to recognize that, yes, this is the color blue, which is rooted in the memory, which happens further down the line, deeper down in the mind, through formations. Formations are conditioned by ignorance in the case of a mind in which the links of dependent origination continue to flow without wisdom. But whether one is experiencing full wisdom or not, in both cases, formations also are triggered by contact of one of the six sense bases, which means, taking the example of recognizing the color blue, when we first learn that that is the color blue, that then creates a formation, a mental formation, that then activates the perception or recognition aspect that, yes, that is the color blue. And then the consciousness, as we earlier discussed, is rooted through the mentality, materiality, and the six sense bases, and is experienced through feeling. It's conjoined with feeling and perception, and it's the cognition aspect, which is tied to one or more of the sensory experiences. This kind of consciousness is not eternal. In fact, it is known as vijnana in Pali, which means the dividing knowledge, the discriminative knowledge, which means such a consciousness is always divided up between the experiences of the senses, and which then therefore cognizes the different experiences. And then through that, one is able to perceive, one is able to understand what is arising and what is occurring. But each sensory experience, each quanta or iota of sensory experience is equal to 1 quanta or iota of a sensory consciousness. There is the idea of the consciousness that is not established in the mentality and materiality. It is the consciousness that is void of conceptualization and void of mental proliferation. However, such a consciousness is not eternal either. It arises when one sees through with wisdom the links of dependent origination and understands the 3 characteristics, and therefore completely lets go all concepts of name and form, all concepts related to name and form. And then such a consciousness is the cognizing, in some sense, of having entered into nibbana, or having entered out of, let's say, nirodha, and experiencing that awakening. That is the consciousness that is unrooted from the mentality and materiality. It is the pure awareness or pure consciousness of the arising of the links of dependent origination without any involvement, without any sense of self, without any personalizing, void of any craving. But as soon as that is experienced, it then dissipates like any other kind of consciousness. It is not eternal. This is very important to understand, to root out any misconceptions and misguidances the mind might have about a permanent, pure, overarching, all-encompassing consciousness that is a soul. That is not what it is. It is a consciousness that is unrooted from mentality, materiality, and it is the awareness of the arising of links of dependent origination without any involvement, which leads into the contact with the nibbana element, which leads into a contact that is pure and void of any personalization, of any craving. So what we need to understand and see here is that everything that arises is to be taken as impermanent, because by the very nature of it arising through causes and conditions, by the very nature of it occurring, it will pass away. Because as soon as you take away those causes and conditions, it will fall apart, whatever it might be. And this is what are the 5 aggregates. They are built up through the flow of the links of dependent origination. They are built up through craving, and that clinging aspect is the desire and lust or aversion that gets rooted in the experience from or arising out of or related to in any way of any or each or all of the 5 aggregates. So nibbana in that sense is the deconditioning of this. It's the detachment of having attached a sense of self. It's the uninvolvement of whatever is arising and tending the mind, inclining the mind towards the cessation aspect of reality. Because that is the 3rd noble truth. The cessation of craving is the cessation of suffering. This is experienced through the Nirodha Samapatti, through the cessation of perception and feeling, but it is also experienced in every moment if one reflects and understands through the experience of the 5th jhana, and therefore lets go and doesn't grasp and enters into nothingness, and then further understands that the perception of that nothingness in the meditation is another factor, is another obstruction that needs to be let go in looking at it through wisdom. That such a perception of nothingness in the realm of nothingness in the 7th jhana is rooted in an idea and concept of nothingness that emerges from the mind and is fabricated through the formations of the mind. When you see this, you start to lose disinterest in that nothingness. You start to become disenchanted with that level of nothingness. And then you are dispassionate. And then you start to see through this nothingness, and the mind sinks even deeper into neither perception nor non-perception. And in such a level of meditation, in such a level of understanding, there is the disenchantment with perception itself. There is the disenchantment with all formations that are arising. One is aware of what is happening, but it is like a lucid deep sleep, has always been explained in many different ways. It's therefore neither perception nor non-perception. It's the loosening of the attachment to perception. And in this process, there will be very subtle formations that will start to arise. But once again, you have to continue to stay with your vehicle of meditation, which in the 8th jhana becomes the tranquil mind. But the way to do it is to not identify with that tranquil mind, not to attach a personal sense of self with that tranquil mind. Understand that that tranquil mind actually emerged from a series of causes and conditions through the preceding jhanas, as one was able to get deeper and deeper, and therefore then relax the mind to such a level that very subtle formations arise few and far in between. So it's important to disidentify and detach the sense of self to that tranquil mind, let go of any concepts that might arise from that tranquil mind. And by letting go of the subtlest formations, you come to a even deeper stillness, which in some suttas is known as the signless samadhi, the signless collectedness, where not paying attention to any formations, not paying attention to any fabrications that can lead to conditioned states. One is in a state where there is no formations that are attended to with the mind. It's a deeper level of stillness that occurs at the border point of the 8th jhana and the cessation of perception and feeling. And this signless collectedness also needs to be let go of. It's the very subtlest formations that are related to it that need to be let go of, because that too is produced by consciousness. That too is produced by formations. When you see through it with wisdom in the meditation and let go of that and continue to let go, of any expectations of nibbana to even arise, at a certain point that stillness drops even further. And since there are no more causes and conditions for feeling, perception, and consciousness to arise in that state, there is the cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness. And then there is a blank. And you know there was a blank only when you emerge out of it. And when you emerge out of it, there is the seeing of the links of dependent origination. And by detaching from the personalizing of those links, you are experiencing the nibbana element at the level of contact. But it will take time to root out, because then there is a certain level of personalizing with the relief that might arise. And by doing that, there is a craving for wanting to experience it yet again. That is why the projections or the defilements or the taints are still present until you come to the point of arahatship, where you see that even identifying with the relief that arises from that nibbana experience needs to be let go of, or is not even attended to and is disidentified with, by doing that, you then destroy the taint of sensual craving, because there's no more craving attached to it. There's no more grasping attached to it. You also, because you disidentify with it, the destruction of the defilement of the taint of being. There is no more becoming there. It is the destruction of becoming. It's the destruction of the accumulation of tendencies through craving. And therefore, there is also the knowledge and the right vision, the effective vision, the right view that emerges, which is the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. You have understood them, you have cultivated them, you have developed them, and you have realized them. And therefore, you destroy ignorance. Once you destroy ignorance, the right view or effective vision is what replaces ignorance in the links of dependent origination. And in such a being of a released mind, what is then arising is just pure old karma that was produced prior to full awakening. And it is this karma then that activates through the level of contact the formations, which then activate a consciousness, which establishes itself through a mentality materiality, and which is then experienced through the six sense bases, and that is the feeling or sensation aspect of the links to dependent origination, as well as the five aggregates. But the difference here is, as soon as it is felt, it is let go of. It is not even attached to for it to be let go of, because one has seen through with wisdom that anything that arises is impermanent, and anything that is impermanent is suffering. And anything that is impermanent and suffering cannot be considered to be me, mine, or myself, or I, or to be considered to be a sense of personal, permanent, unchanging, independent self. And therefore, at that level of feeling with such a wise perception, craving is impossible to arise. It's impossible for craving to arise. And therefore, whatever karma is arising through that process is then terminated at the level of feeling. This is how it is understood through the deep levels of meditation and insight into the three characteristics of reality. The three characteristics are marks of existence. And when it is understood in this way, at the level of feeling, at the level of the six sense bases, in conjunction with the five aggregates, the clinging aspect is destroyed. One no longer grasps onto anything. And by not grasping, as the Buddha says, the mind is liberated. And there is the knowledge of that liberation and the knowledge of the destruction of the taints. And one has therefore attained final liberation. Any questions?
Hello, I have a quick.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You mentioned the signless samadhi at
Yeah.
the, and but the Buddha didn't mention that very often, did he?
No, not very often, no. This usually arises when you start to let go of any kinds of formations that arise in the eighth jhana. And it's primarily able to be accessed when you have one experience of nibbana. In other words, you start to develop the mind to where you have had a cessation experience. and you're able to better recognize that state that lies between the eighth jhana and the cessation of perception and feeling.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I have one question.
Yes.
It's regarding, like when we listen to the Dhamma talk and reading the sutta, we kind of like trying to understand this nothing is really permanent, or the, in consciousness level, like is everything is appearing, disappearing, right? But how would we really know this is not the perceptions that fooling us, or this is the right wisdom that arrive to it? Like some of the Dhamma, because of through the meditations, yes, this I can reconcile it. But at one point, I wanted to know what I'm knowing right now is through my wisdom, not because of reading or listening to Dhamma talk.
Yeah. So the thing about it is, when it comes to perception, anything that arises can be wisdom or wrong view through perception. So in other words, when you have this knowledge, this first-hand experience of impermanence, it arises through perception. So if you perceive it, there's no way you cannot perceive it. So there's nothing wrong with, say, reconciling perception in that regard. What you have to see also is the perception of that impermanence is also impermanent. The perception of that suffering is also suffering. And the perception of that not self is also not self. So you're using, in that case, using the Buddha's metaphor, the raft to get to the other shore. You're using the five aggregates. You're using these processes to get to the point that you let go of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So coming to the other part of that also is that, yes, we read about these things.
Yeah.
And it kind of creates an idea in our mind, the concept of impermanence and the concept of emptiness and the concept of not self and so on and so forth. But the real experience happens only in deeper levels of reflection, which can happen through the jhana practice, through the meditation practice. But if you have even just a deeper layer of mind while just sitting down and reflecting on the Dhamma with perception that is rooted in right view, or that is essentially open to the Dhamma, this is why you have in cases of Sotapannas who, upon listening to the Dhamma with wise perception, with wise reflection, able to let go and see in the arising of the next arising of the links of dependent origination, how this is a impermanent and impersonal process. And therefore they let go of that sense of self and they understand. And then of course the first three fetters for them are destroyed. So it happens always when you let go of concepts. And these concepts are let go when you come to deeper levels of jhanas. So that's important to also understand, is when you're in the deeper levels of meditation, that as you're experiencing these things, yes, in the beginning it will be like, oh wow, look at that. Oh wow, look at this. And then you start to attach a sense of self to it. But then you have to pull back. You don't want to push and you don't want to expect the same things again through that practice, through that experience. You have to just allow the mind to unfold and unravel. It's like a waiting game. You just continue to wait for that mind to unravel. And in the seeing of it, you will understand. So it's not a matter of projecting what you have read onto the experience. It's allowing the
Yes.
experience to verify what you have read.
Okay. Thank you.
Delson,
Yes.
when Buddha is continuously talking about how to uproot yourself from the world and cut out the connections with even the 5 senses, 6 senses, how does a lay person continue to live in the world when you're constantly trying to uproot yourself?
So that's the thing. You look at it from the perspective of the 4 levels of awakening. If someone has understood the 3 symptoms of reality, or the 3 characteristics of existence, of this impermanence, of this suffering, and of this not self, they start to detach very slowly, bit by bit, any sense of personal self to it. That's only the first level. That's only the first layer. And then the other aspect is that there will still be craving. There will still be aversion. There will still be the higher fetters of taking something personal, of restlessness, of sloth and torpor and ignorance and so on. So it's at the level of Sakadagami where you start to, it's the second level, where you start to deteriorate any sense of craving. It's very much minimized. It's very minimal. And then you come to the third level, which is the Anagami, where you completely destroy the sense of craving and the sense of aversion. So lust and ill will, or the craving for wanting more or for avoiding something because it affects a sense of self, is destroyed. So then in that case, in the level of an Anagami, the first 5 fetters are completely destroyed. And what's remaining to do now is to uproot the last 5 fetters, which is the conceit, which is the restlessness, which is the ignorance, and so on. So in the level of the Anagami, this is the work that's left to be done, and then they attain arahatship. When you attain arahatship, you let go of all concepts of being a layperson or being a monk or being anything. You destroy that idea of being itself. And by destroying that sense of being, it doesn't mean that such a person in that regard is non-functional. There is still karma to be played out. The only difference now is that there is no more identification with that karma, which would have arisen because of causes and conditions prior to full awakening. So what's left to do is to experience that karma without personalizing it. And that's done through skillful means. In the case of an arahat, that's done through wisdom. So in that case, the functioning of an arahat in day-to-day living is essentially based on external factors, which are essentially karma. There is no personalized intention behind an action of a arahat, of a fully enlightened being. They are essentially functioning based out of one of the 4 Brahma Viharas because they have cultivated to a point where it becomes their nature, and because they've cultivated the Eightfold Path and especially understood and cultivated right speech, right action, and right livelihood that is rooted in right intention, that are all ultimately rooted in the perfected right view of the 4 Noble Truths, that the way of functioning through the Eightfold Path becomes their automatic way of life, their automatic mode of functioning. So it's like having reconditioned and purified the mind and then install this new software of the Eightfold Path, which is through the continuous exercising of the Eightfold Path before full awakening. And then that just becomes the benchmark of action for an arahat, for an enlightened being.
So if you link this to the concept of karma, then everything is right. So there's no karma that gets created, right?
For an enlightened being, there will be no more karma created after awakening, because they have seen through everything, good, bad, indifferent, neutral, as being not self, as being empty of any permanent substantial self. So anything that arises is completely not attended to as something that is affecting that being. It's just arising and passing away, and therefore it's just terminated at the level of having experienced it. Because in the level of someone who is not fully realized, they will still have some sense of self attached to it, and they will still continue to create some new karma because of that, and therefore suffering. But when you are fully awakened, you understand this karma also to be not self, impersonal, and therefore you won't produce any new karma, because there's no intentions that are rooted in a personal sense of self, that are rooted in conceit or ignorance.
Yeah. Tough to live with Buddha.
Delson?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a little question about the state you described. The intermediate state between the signless concentration. You said that just before cessation this happens. And the way I understand is as you progress in your attainment, then you can actually slow down and sustain that state to be experienced that on your will. Is that how you develop your kind of ability and go into cessation and come back by your kind of predetermination? And that is a very kind of delicate state. And would you have some sort of development approach and some sort of, are you able to have some sort of control, or I don't know?
Yeah, it's in the same way that you would develop your determinations for jhanas, and then finally develop your determination for cessation of perception and feeling. This intermediary state of the signless concentration or signless collectedness is a result of having let go of all things that are considered to be impermanent and no longer attending to them. So it can be accessed through determination practice. And it's a matter of letting go of those formations that create your sense of reality and that sense of permanence to reality. So you are seeing through the permanence and understanding that there is nothing permanent. It is in fact all impermanent. And when you come to that level, you start to drop all formations. You start to abandon all movement within the mind. But there is still a perception aspect. There's still a awareness or consciousness aspect that is still experiencing that signless state, that is still experiencing that signless samadhi. That's why when you see this and let go of even the perception of that, beyond neither perception or non-perception, and understand that even this is fabricated through the formations, through one's intentions, you let go of that, and then you go into cessation of perception and feeling as well. So it is something that can be predetermined through development of the determinations.
Wait, one more question.
Yes.
You mentioned about consciousness that is kind of not attached in any form. which is still impermanent, which is still cannot be held on to.
Yeah.
And, that is not linked to the name and form. Yeah. And as you said, that it is still impermanent. And there is if I understand, there is another awareness which you call as conscious cessation. These are two states you mentioned. What are the kind of, you mentioned that you can stay in conscious cessation after emerging from cessation. So this intermediate state of what is called unestablished consciousness is an intermediate state before entering the conscious cessation. So, would you be able to describe a little bit more that kind of steps or sort of process?
Yeah, so you're referring to conscious cessation, which is the understanding and experience of the Third Noble Truth. So it's basically where the five aggregates are void of any clinging, and therefore the feeling that arises and the perception that arises is pure. And when I say pure, that means it's basically void of craving. So this conscious cessation that you're talking about is essentially the attending the mind, or the mind attending to the cessation aspect of reality. Right now, for beings who are not fully awakened, they tend to have their mind basically contemplating or attended towards the arising aspect of reality and the aspect of reality between arising and cessation. But the conscious cessation is arisen or is experienced through understanding that the feeling that arises is not self. The feeling that arises, therefore, will not produce any craving. So it's basically, the conscious cessation is a mind that is void of any craving. So it's a state in the fully awakened being, which is their constant state of being in that regard, so to speak. There is no being in that sense, but it's their state of mind, where there is no even concepts of craving. There is no idea of a sense of self. And therefore, the mind doesn't abide in anything. It's a mind that never abides in any kind of concepts. There can be conceptualization for the purposes of being here in reality, but in that process of seeing that, the fully awakened being sees through those concepts. So they are using those concepts to function within reality, but they are able to see through it.
So you can be walking, you can be doing your work, you can still be in that state, right?
Exactly. So when you're doing your work, we'll take the example of meditation itself. For an awakened being, there is no sense of meditation with a sense of self. It's just pure meditation. It's meditation without a meditator and meditation without an object. There is just pure meditation happening. So when that happens, that meditation is always in the level of the Third Noble Truth, which is cessation. So there's a cessation of perception and feeling that arises or happens at the point of letting go of all formations. But that letting go of all formations itself is an action that is rooted from some kind of an intention. But in the case of conscious cessation, while one sees what one is seeing with the eyes or experiencing the rest of the senses, cognizing with consciousness, perceiving with perception, and experiencing reality, there is no sense of an experiencer happening. It's just pure experience that is going on.
And I guess there is no fear arising as such. There is no sense of danger of, there is some sort of awareness in terms of you need to function your body. Yeah, you need to keep the life going. Yeah, so that sort of senses will still prevail. Yeah.
Yeah, and those are rooted in the biological senses of the body, in the sense that there is hunger arising, and so one satisfies the body's hunger, but doesn't identify with that hunger. There is thirst arising, so one quenches the thirst, but there's no sense of attachment of self to that thirst or the quenching of that thirst. So everything that's arising is just a natural aspect of the body, let's say, for example, but there's nobody there to really be satisfied with or to be satisfied for. It's just a pure experience that's going on.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, don't have any questions. Okay, this sort of controlled perception of what we say, it is only available to the anagami level, or those who are still practicing and who have experienced cessation. They cannot sustain this, correct?
Which state is that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about the conscious cessation. It only becomes once you have developed the determination to stay in the cessation and to emerge from that as you will.
There is still the fetter of being for the anagami. So because of that, the development of conscious cessation only occurs when there is no being there. So it is something that is basically experienced and is sort of only experienced by the arhat, because they have rooted out the fetters of being. So there's no one there to experience it. But in the case of an anagami, there is still conceit, there's still this very subtle level of sense of self, this level of I, which then therefore limits their ability to be able to be in that conscious cessation. Because as soon as you attach a sense of self to it, you are no longer in that state, so to speak. You are no longer attending to the cessation aspect. Because the sense of I is the birth of I. There has to be a birth of I, a birth of being, for that experience to be there in the case of an anagami. But for an arahat, there is no being, there is no birth. It's just the experience that's going on. There is the understanding of that experience through pure consciousness or pure cognition and pure perception. But in the case of an anagami, if they were to experience it, the moment they have the idea that I am experiencing this, they have lost it. So it's only sustainable and approachable and completely understood at the level of arahatship.
Any advice for those who are trying to get there? What are the tips or sort of your advice? What are the abilities they need to sharpen for home?
Yeah.
And where do you see what are the kind of weaknesses, or sort of what are the things that should be cultivated for those who progress?
Take out the I from the equation of the practice. So when you are doing jhana practice, approach it from the idea that there is only jhana going on, there is only the meditation going on. Don't attach any sense of I am going to practice now, or I am in this jhana, or I am experiencing these factors of jhana. Come from it from a detached, in that sense, detached sense of observation, like you're watching something unfold through a microscope. So when you're watching something unfold through a microscope or a telescope or any kind of apparatus, like a scientist in that regard, there's no sense of self attached to it. You're just observing it for the pure purpose of observation, without any expectations. The expectations are rooted in the sense of I, rooted in the craving to replicate that experience that was felt before. As soon as you root out that sense of I, me, or mine, it will help develop the ability to cut out that sense of I. It will basically help you to weaken the fetter of conceit and finally destroy the defilement of being. So in your meditation practice, in your daily living, just see the experience as it is, without attaching any personalized I to it. Just watch it, and that's it. And even in that watching, don't have a sense of I of watching it or observing it.
I would probably say this is hardest to Delson. And I see some kind of a sense of fear, or we are kind of so accustomed to our ability to experience and to experience some unknown. There is some sort of fear. How we can overcome that? Or shall we just call it let mind do whatever it likes with our experiences? It's kind of give it to mind to deal with that, to overcome fear.
To overcome fear, you're saying? Yeah.
I want to add to what he's asking. Say, if you go through a lot of trauma, manipulation, exploitation, how does such a person disassociate from all those things and go back to equanimity and meditation and all those things? So coming back to what was the starting point of this session, does such a person get tainted, or the one who is causing all this, all these negative things get tainted? Does the person experiencing the trauma get tainted, or the person causing all these things get tainted? If you have to associate yourself from the taints, how do the taints actually form?
You're asking the question from a sense of self. So to say
yes.
that...
But you...
So if you're going to say that one or the other is tainted, you're still asking from a sense of self. You cannot say that this is tainted or that is tainted. As soon as you do that, you're projecting a sense of being to one or two of those things.
But there are taints which the Buddha was trying to remove, right?
Excuse me?
But there are taints which the Buddha was trying to remove from Rāhula. So how do these taints actually form?
You're talking about in relation to the defilements, the taints of sensual craving and of being and of ignorance. These are built up over experiences, over different moments of choices. So in the case of sensual craving, there is a pendulous, like a pendulum, the way it swings from to and fro. There's that kind of an activity that happens whenever one chooses to identify with sensual craving and to identify with the feeling. And this feeds and strengthens the taint of sensual craving. Likewise, that sensual craving, the taint of sensual craving, further fuels the sense of craving in a next given moment. In the same way, at the level of being, if you identify and cling to a sense of self, accumulate tendencies, and then identify with those accumulated tendencies that are that sense of being, you're going to strengthen those taints, that taint of being. And not knowing and understanding and applying the Four Noble Truths, which means that as soon as you have seen craving arisen, you do not let go of it. You are further deepening the taint for ignorance to arise. In one of the suttas, there is a sutta in which Sariputta talks about what is the origin of ignorance. And he says the origin of ignorance are the taints, the defilements. And then he asks, what are the origin of the defilements or the taints? And he says that ignorance is. So the ultimate root or the cause of these taints are rooted in not knowing and understanding the Four Noble Truths, which means you identify with suffering. You don't understand suffering. You don't understand that the cause of suffering is craving and therefore identify with that craving. You don't understand that the cessation of craving is cessation of suffering, and therefore you identify with holding on to things rather than letting them go, and you build up more a sense of self, more of ignorance, more of desire for sensual cravings and sensual experiences and pleasures. And then finally, you don't follow or understand the Eightfold Path, which is the way to that cessation. So in the case of one who has the defilements, the work to be done is to develop the understanding of the Four Noble Truths by walking the Eightfold Path. In one who has destroyed the defilements, as I said earlier, the difference is that the Eightfold Path becomes the automatic mode of functioning for such a being.
Can I get a few more minutes of your time here? Just you were explaining a little bit about how we can overcome that state of fear. I mean, that sort of fears occur when you're trying to go into the cessation. Sort of, you are losing yourself, or you are losing your consciousness. And that sort of fears keep coming back. So, yeah. How can we address that?
That's the deep root of conceit, that deep root of being that is basically disallowing you to accept cessation to occur. It's causing that fear because that false sense of self knows that it's no longer going to be experienced and is trying to hold on to through the conceit of the mind. It's trying to hold on to with that fear. So you have to let go of it by understanding it in this way. You have to let go of that fear by letting go of that conceit, letting go of that sense of being, which is when that happens, you just sink into into cessation. And when I say you sink into cessation, I'm using it as a way of understanding. Really, it's just a set of, or a series of conditions that lead to the unfolding, that lead to the unbinding of being, that lead to the process of unbecoming, of unbeing, and of unforming, the unconditioned or the unconditioning, that then takes you to that cessation experience.
Okay, there is no more question. We're coming up to almost an hour and a half, so shall we just wrap up with the merit?
May the suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Dhadu, dhadu, dhadu.